Anyway, so I'm a lawyer, based in Barcelona, and have been working with open source technologies, universities, clients for the last 25 years. I started in the .com. Does anybody remember .com? I can see some elderly people here. And I had all these, in a small startup, and they had all these software developers. They come up to me with this kind of like the MIT or the LGPL or whatever, because the LGPL was around in those days. And they say, what does this mean? And the trouble working with software developers is that they actually read the text and they understand it, they parse it, and then they say, no, there's all sorts of loopholes in this text. It's badly written. So I had to explain to them a little bit what the licensing was about, which is, as we know, a little bit the constitutional documents of a lot of the open source projects. And it's one of the ways that trust is built, is because if we are working on a project together and we are using the same license and licensing out under those terms, then that does build trust, as Catherine was saying, as a key element for collaborating. Anyway, so I'm a lawyer, so I've been asked to talk about business aspects of it, which is kind of like just about right. Probably because I'm old and had 25 years more than actually my competence in legal skills. But it's true that the open source world has gone through a whole series of paradigms. I don't know what you want to call it, ways of doing things, approaches. And I think if anybody was around in the 1980s, no, probably not, 90s, I think definitely people around the 1990s, it's maybe everything to do with technology, no? It's all technology. And suddenly 2000, the .com and post that, money got involved, or say business got involved. Money's always there, but businesses got involved. And they thought, well, this maybe, there should be business in this, and there's a business opportunity here. So this is why we're talking about it, because as we saw yesterday, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of logos, big names, small names, which are businesses and are involved in open source. So I've been asked a little bit to say, well, what's their interest, and can we do business with open source, and how that's done? Because a lot of, does anybody remember the FUD back in 2002? GPL, it's viral, it's kind of like communist, you can't do business on GPL. Who thinks you can't do business on GPL? Great, you're not escorted from the room, so you'll stay here. Of course we do business on GPL. I mean, the largest open source company, I think, is probably still Red Hat, not quite sure. Most of its business is based around GPL code, so copyleft code. But that, in the old days, was kind of like, whoa, really, really difficult. Difficult to understand. So I obviously spent many years, too many years, trying to explain what the GPL does. Does anybody understand the GPL? There are too many liars in the room. No one understands the GPL. At least close to B of the GPL. Well, no, but it's good enough. So business models. I just did this yesterday, as everybody, doing the slides very late, and looked at what people were talking about in business models for last year. This is 2024. Didn't look at this morning. And obviously, it's still in the news. It's still in the blogs. It's still everywhere. We're still talking about business models around open source. Even people who invest, lots of VCs, money investing in open source. So it's quite interesting to explore a little bit the history and to see what is being done, or what has been done, what is successful, and what not to do. So quickly run through some ideas here. The concept of open source business. Wrong. Open source is not a business. There is no such thing, I think, as an open source business model, unless you want your business model to be totally open, which actually will probably not net you any money. Okay. Open source is a technological development model, and I'm probably, any software engineers in the room? There you are, you all know that. It's all about software development. It's all about collaborating. It's all about building code. And certainly in the 90s, it was nothing to do with making money or running a business. It doesn't mean to say that businesses were not involved. Of course they were, very heavily. But the actual purpose, or the role, or the approach of open source was nothing to do with making money or being a business. And that is something the message was lost, or that idea was lost in the 2000, 2010. Even today, people are still saying open source business means selling open source code. Well, has anybody sold open source code? No, you see, no one sells. You can't sell open source code, mainly because it's probably not yours to sell. But what you do is, obviously, you build a business around the open source code. So the most important thing, and I think it's still really relevant to understand if people are thinking about building business around open source, is that you have to think that it's a technological development model, and you have to respect the concepts of collaboration, openness, and traceability, that we're seeing in open. So that's really, really important, which means that we don't look at open source business, we say open source based business. That's a key word that changes everything. And we suddenly find that, open source based business, Microsoft, IBM, and all those companies that the Linux Foundation was showing us, but also, two guys who are Linux hackers and doing some support and maintenance on the local Linux server. That's an open source based business. So that's actually essential to understand that. And if we look back I've said 1980 because I think some of the first licenses were drafted in the early 1800s, but the first models or business models around open source, certainly in the first years, were mainly providing professional services around open source. So building, collaborating, developing, contributing, and building the internet was built on open source, in those days. Building actually, in fact, even running up to 2000, I'm looking at the .com platform. So we were looking at Java and all that stuff happening in those days, and lots of web servers running the Apache web server, which I think was 1992. So the first business model we can talk about is professional services. And that runs, I put 2000, but we'll see later that obviously it's not something that's been dropped. Okay? The trouble with that, for anybody who's investing in that, is that it's not scalable, it's not very profitable, and it's not sustainable. If you're doing professional services, if you want to earn more money, you need more people. More people means more expense. It means finding the talent. It means, especially today, a very high rotation of technical staff because they get better salaries elsewhere. So you have to increase your salaries to keep the talent. So it's not a really good business, and venture capitals or anybody investing in that did not see that as a particular way to go. Doesn't mean that there's lots of really good open source businesses or open source based businesses, which actually their main revenue stream is still providing professional services. Look at those guys with the funny red hats. So you have to rethink a little bit. So the open source bit's about technological development. So what about the business bit? So business means, and this is kind of like a generalization, I didn't do any MBA or I'm not from Harvard, but selling a product and service that provides a solution to the market on a continuous and sustainable basis. I think that's probably a generalization, but there's. Where's the open source there? And where is technology? There, it's not. It's about products and services. And this is, I think, one of the biggest challenges or problems that young people starting up a business around open source, they don't really understand, or they haven't really thought through that technology is technology and a product is what the market wants. In fact, sometimes the market doesn't even want a product, they want a solution. It's like the old story about Bosch. We know what Bosch sells. They don't sell drills. They sell holes in walls, because what people actually want is the hole in the wall to hang the painting or whatever Picasso they have in their garage. So the market industry don't necessarily want software and lots of lines of code. It's expensive to run, you have to maintain it. What they want is a solution. They want things to happen. They want electronic health records so that patients can actually see their records online. Okay? So business means that. So taking the open source as a technical development model and not as a business. So how do we bridge this gap? I think that's really important. So what we have to kind of jump from is from an open source based business, which may not be sustainable, may not be easy, but actually we're earning some money around working with open source. We have to make this sustainable. So here we're moving into the 2000s, 2005s. And that's really actually quite difficult. And we've seen loads and loads of mainly SMBs starting up, doing some open source, contributing or maintaining a project, and then the staff leave, or the technology is no longer, someone else has built something better. So it's actually quite difficult to do this. And so what happened in those years is I think people were saying, well, we know that products work. We've seen the business model of Microsoft, SAP, Oracle. They sell licenses. Let's see if we can sell licenses, because that's a way maybe of generating income and reinvesting that into the open source development process. So those were the years when I think if anybody here do you remember Alfresco, Pentaho? Lots of these companies that were built around open source, but they were offering things like. So the first thing they did was try to productize it. I use these horrible, dare I say, American terms. So what they did is, okay, well, let's do dual licensing. There's the open source license on the one hand, and then there's sell licenses, proprietary commercial style license on the other. Famous model, MySQL, I think. Started in the 1990s, actually, but went live on a commercial basis in the early 2000s. And their model was saying, if you pay me good money for a better, the same code actually MySQL was very much the same code, two different licenses. Their offer to the community was saying they will reinvest some part of the profit they were making into continuing maintaining the sustainability of the open project, which was run. And that was one of the models they had for making money and running a business around open source. Open Core was the other one. This is where the core, there's a version, the community version, often called community version, where there's a kind of like minimum features sufficient enough for the community, were under an open license. But if you wanted anything sexy, if you wanted anything that worked, that was enterprise, that would run on a larger platform with many more users or whatever, then you had to pay for additional things. So again, it's basically saying we're using open source technologies, but we're selling proprietary licenses. Okay, so it's still not an open source based business in a way. I mean, the technology is open source, but there's nothing really. Those two run into all sorts of problems, and many of the open core companies died out in the end. Lots of VC, lots of capital going into it, lots of disappointment. A lot of them migrated, they merged into the next idea was when the cloud happened. That a lot of things says, oh, well, first of all, the GPL doesn't work in the cloud, so we can use a lot more GPL, and we don't have to distribute any code because it's up on the cloud server. So we'll be providing open source as a service. Classic example, MongoDB. We all know Mongo. They've been through different licenses and different models and different things like that. But everything was moved into the cloud because, as I said, business doesn't really want lines of code. What they want is data to be managed or sent somewhere. So that was the next model, I think. And a lot of the open core moved their offerings to the cloud and said, the code is here, you can run it, it's complex, it's great, you can download it, you can contribute. But if you want the commercial advantages, then you subscribe to our online offerings, okay? Microsoft did the same thing, I think, in the end. Ended up with Office 365. And then obviously the platforms came in. And so, I think the largest open source based business in the world, what would you think? I think it's Amazon Web Services, one of the largest, Google. Tech giants, as we saw just in the previous talks. I'm not saying that 90% of their code is open source, but a significant amount is. And what the platforms were doing, obviously, were taking advantage, piggybacking, free riding, depends what you want to call it, on a lot of open source projects. And if you look at Amazon Web Services, for example, there are literally thousands of open source technologies embedded into their stack. And to the extent that Elastic, for example, got a bit pissed off, if I may say, because they thought they were being taken advantage of, and that these big platforms were not contributing back into the community. Okay? So there's some various, at least 4 models there, of making money around open source and trying to generate some revenue stream. The question is, revenue stream for what? And if it was revenue stream for going into your pockets or into the venture capital pockets, then that did not work, unfortunately. A lot of these people saying, yeah, but there's still that, we're competing with ourselves because we're running this open source project. It's under an open license. Anybody can do what they want with it. They can download and they can build their own, technology stack. And we're offering a commercial for money. Who's going to buy this? Okay? So this is why obviously the open core was saying, well, they're buying the extensions. But what was happening also was that there's quite a lot of free riding to the extent that there were, bona fide businesses using lots of open source, as we've just seen, and not just being users. I think one of the comments I would make this morning is that we've been talking a little bit too much about being users of open source and not being contributors and building open source. I think that's an essential point to make. Is that, and we'll see later on, I'm a bit of a spoiler, so I'm not going to say it. Anyway, so what happened, if you'll see, is that we saw what was often called FOPEN, so false open licensing. So we had the commercial clause, which if I remember right, it was from Mongo had it, and there's about 3 or 4 or 5 other ones. There's a couple of database companies. Elastic had some clauses in there. And basically, they went out of the open source space because they had a restriction on use. So they were saying, yeah, it's open for everybody, except if you're a platform. Okay? Or it's okay for everybody, except if you're competing with me, which is some of the OpenAI licenses are coming out like that. It's interesting to see. Okay? Or we have, coming out of universities, typical myth, it's open source for everybody except for commercial purposes. So that's not open source. That's academic or available source, or what you want to call it. Okay? So that's I think we're in the 2020s. And that happened. And there was a lot of pushback against that type, those models, that approach. Is saying we're moving away from what open source really is about, which is collaborative development, and more into let's try and make some money out of these technologies, which is fine. It's not a problem. But does it create sustainable communities, which is what really the core thing's about? Okay. And we saw, for example, Mapj, they changed their licensing from totally permissive Mapbox to paid up things. Okay. So I think. And this is where a little bit the thoughts where I've got to at the moment is well, not very important, but I mean something I think about is, okay, what is the business of open source? And the business of open source, I think, is that it's not necessarily aimed at making money. I think the business of open source is actually ensuring that the open source projects which your business is based on are sustainable and can operate. Okay, the typical story of the Nebraskan with who's holding up a hole, things like that. That's one of them, but I think it's much more than that. Obviously, there are many companies that are not really technical. They're not going to be contributing back, okay? But there are other ways to be a member of a community. And so if we look at my kind of like virtual circle, we've started from open source-based businesses. We've tried to make them sustainable. I think what the people are finding out today is that the only way to make your business that's based on open source sustainable is to ensure that the projects that you're using and contributing are sustainable. So really important to invest back into the community. I think that's what we've been talking about. I think government are a bit more aware of this, because they run economies and they have citizens. They don't have clients, so I think their concept of sustainability is stronger in that sense and very important for maintaining the strength of these communities, which a lot of them are still volunteer people. There's lots of universities out there, and they're key technologies. And they're not all going to be able to set up a business model and have their own financing for running it. Which is why I think sometimes like the foundation model, like Linux Foundation, is one way to go. Okay, for investing that. So if we go back to the basics and look, what do we need for strengthening our community? It's skills, scalability, low cost, network effects. Not really looking at the money. You still need money. I think we all need money. You need sales, but sales from whom for what? And I think the story of Elastic and Amazon, the love-hate relationship is very classic on this. Is that Elastic was saying that Amazon was making a lot of money based on their technologies. And they changed their license to avoid that type of free riding. And actually, just last week, what happened? Last month, September. Elastic says, in the end, I think we'll go the open source way. We'll go back to being open source under a real open source license, which they're using the AGPL. Because they're back to seeing value, and their story is they're seeing value in being a better member of the community and trying to get people coming back into their project to make it more sustainable. Lots of the developers were moving to OpenSearch, they're moving to other alternative technologies that were actually open. So I think we've come a full circle. So we're trying to set up an open source based business. We're trying to make it sustainable. We realize that to make that sustainable, we have to make the projects themselves sustainable, and that actually enables the business to be run. So I think it's pretty neat. Thought of it last night. No, I didn't. It's quite a thing. But I think it's where we are in 2025. It'd be interesting this afternoon to see about open source AI, if that's going to be different. I think there's the economics of AI is very, very different. Needs many more resources, much more data. Data is very complex. But just looking at the basics of, we're in 101, so we're looking at basics here, of this. I think this is a kind of like a quick rundown. So we must just remember, it's not a business. Open source is not a business. It cannot be run like a business because it has different values and different ways of collaborating. If business means selling, then you need to define what the product is and what the service is. And that's, I work a lot with universities, and they have these PIs, principal investigators, researchers, brilliant people, fantastic bioinformatics pipeline or molecular, identification or whatever. They say, yeah, we can set up a business on this. And we say, well, what does industry actually want? What are you actually offering? I say, I don't know, but we've got lots of people using this. You say, well, who are these people? Oh, they're all the scientists who work with that in the same community. And are they going to pay for a license for this? They said, no, they can use it under an open license. Why? We're not going to charge them. So actually finding what your that business and that solution is essential. And there's no case to make because the case has already been made. I mean, the amount of open source that's being used by industry is phenomenal. So there obviously is a case there. Okay? And I think it's essential to come back to where we are and saying the actual business of doing this, the way to make this thing is to make things sustainable. And that's it. Thank you very much.